Welcome back to the attic. When you go through a World War II veteran's footlocker, you expect to find certain things. American medals, letters from home, maybe a dented canteen or a brass compass. But when I opened this small canvas pouch hidden at the bottom of my grandfather's trunk, I didn't find American gear. I found this, an authentic German Luftwaffe patch. My grandfather, Bill, was an American military policeman. He wasn't a paratrooper dropping behind enemy lines. He wasn't a spy. He was stationed in liberated Holland near the very end of the war, processing prisoners and refugees. So, how did he end up with a piece of a German pilot's uniform? I checked his diary for the spring of 1945. What I found wasn't a story of combat. It was a story of Grand Theft Auto. Or rather, Grand Theft Aviation. When we think of POW escapes prisoners of war, we think of Hollywood movies. We think of men spending 6 months digging a tunnel with a spoon. We think of forged passports, fake German accents, and sneaking onto trains in the dead of night. But there was one American pilot who didn't have time for spoons or tunnels. He was a man who believed that if you're going to escape a German prison camp, you shouldn't walk. You should fly. He walked into an abandoned enemy airfield, found the most lethal fighter plane the Nazis possessed, hotwired it without a manual, and flew it to freedom. Today on G.I.Stories, we are going to trace the ultimate joyride. This is the story of Bob Hoover, the Focke-Wulf 190, and the greatest escape of World War II. Chapter 1. The Pilot's Pilot. To understand the sheer audacity of this escape, you have to understand the man who pulled it off. His name was Robert A. Bob Hoover. If you ask aviation historians, or if you ask General Jimmy Doolittle, or even if you ask Chuck Yeager, the first man to break the sound barrier, they will all tell you the same thing. Bob Hoover was the greatest stick-hand rudder pilot who ever lived. Hoover was a natural. He was the kind of guy who could fly a plane upside down, pour a glass of iced tea, and not spill a single drop because he understood positive G-forces better than the engineers who built the planes. In 1944, he was flying Spitfires with the 52nd Fighter Group, stationed in the Mediterranean Theater. He was an aggressive fighter. He loved the dogfight, but even the best pilots can have a bad day. On February 9, 1944, Hoover was flying a patrol off the coast of southern France, near Nice. His squadron was ambushed by a flight of German Focke-Wulf 190s. The ensuing dogfight was brutal. Hoover's Spitfire was hit hard. The engine caught fire. Shrapnel tore through the cockpit. He was going down. Hoover managed to bail out just before his plane exploded. He landed in the freezing waters of the Mediterranean. He was severely injured, bleeding, and floating miles from shore. He spent hours in the water, waiting for a rescue boat. But when a boat finally arrived, it wasn't flying the Stars and Stripes. It was a German patrol boat. They hauled him out of the water, put a gun to his head, and declared him a prisoner of the Third Reich. For a man who lived to fly, who felt more comfortable in the clouds than on the ground, his wings had just been clipped. He was loaded onto a train and sent to one of the most notorious POW camps in Germany. Chapter 2. The Cage of Stalag Luft I. My grandfather processed POWs after the war, and his diary describes the state these men were in when they were liberated. They were ghosts. Bob Hoover was sent to Stalag Luft I, located in Bart, a miserable freezing town on the Baltic Sea coast. This camp was specifically designed for captured Allied airmen. Life in Stalag Luft I was a slow psychological torture. It wasn't a death camp, but it was a place of deep starvation. The German supply lines were collapsing. They couldn't feed their own soldiers, let alone their prisoners. The daily ration consisted of a watery soup made from rotten turnips, and a slice of bread that was often mixed with sawdust to make it heavy. Hoover's weight plummeted. The once strapping fighter pilot became a walking skeleton, weighing less than 130 pounds. But the physical hunger wasn't the worst part. It was the mental cage. Every day, Hoover and the other pilots would look up and see the white contrails of American B-17s and P-51 Mustangs flying high above Germany, taking the fight to Berlin. They were up there, making history. Hoover was down in the mud, rotting away. He spent 16 months in that camp. 16 months of freezing winters, flea-infested bunk beds, and the constant nagging thought, "I have to get out of here." He tried. Hoover was a troublemaker. He was involved in staging fights to distract guards while other men tried to cut the wire. He spent weeks in solitary confinement for insubordination, but by the spring of 1945, everything changed. The war was ending, but that didn't mean they were safe. In fact, it was the most dangerous time to be a prisoner. The Russian army was advancing rapidly from the east. You could hear the artillery thundering in the distance. The German guards were terrified. They knew what the Russians would do to them if they were captured. Panic began to spread through the camp. Rumors circulated that the SS was coming to execute all the prisoners before the Russians arrived. In this absolute chaos, Bob Hoover saw his window. Chapter 3. The Breakout. It's late April, 1945. The strict discipline of Stalag Luft I is crumbling. Guards are abandoning their posts, throwing away their uniforms, and trying to blend in with the civilian refugees fleeing west. The camp commandant effectively hands control of the camp over to the senior Allied officers. The official order to the prisoners is, "Stay put. Wait for the Allies to arrive. It's too dangerous outside." But Bob Hoover wasn't the kind of guy to sit and wait. He had survived 16 months of starvation. He wasn't going to wait around to see if a rogue SS unit showed up with machine guns. He found a friend, a fellow American pilot, whose name is often recorded just as Jerry. Hoover said, "We're leaving." In the confusion of a riot or a mass movement near the gates, Hoover and Jerry slipped through the wire. They were out, but they weren't free. They were deep inside a collapsing Nazi Germany. The roads were clogged with retreating German soldiers, desperate refugees, and military police who would hang deserters and shoot escaped POWs on sight. For days, they walked. They slept in ditches. They stole food from abandoned farms. Every time they heard a vehicle, they dove into the mud. Their goal was to head west, toward the American or British lines. But walking hundreds of miles in a war zone while starving is a death sentence. One afternoon, while hiding in a dense forest, Hoover heard a sound. It wasn't artillery, it wasn't a tank. It was the deep, guttural cough of a large radial engine, an aviation engine. He grabbed Jerry. They moved through the trees, following the sound. They crested a small hill and looked down. Concealed in the woods, camouflaged by nets and cut branches, was a secret, makeshift Luftwaffe airfield. The Germans had been hiding their remaining planes in forests to protect them from Allied bombers. Hoover looked at the runway. He looked at the few mechanics rushing around. And then, he saw it, sitting under a camouflage net, fueled up and deadly. The plane he was going to steal. Chapter 4. The Butcher Bird. Grandpa's Diary has a whole section dedicated to enemy aircraft recognition. The plane sitting on that dirt runway was a Focke-Wulf FW-190. The Allies called it the Butcher Bird. It was arguably the best fighter the Luftwaffe produced. It was heavily armed with 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns. It was rugged, fast, and terrifying. Now, think about the insanity of this plan. Hoover had never flown a Focke-Wulf. He had never even sat in one. He was an American pilot trained on Spitfires and Mustangs. He didn't speak German. Every gauge, every dial, every switch in that cockpit was labeled in a language he couldn't read. Kraftstoff, jail, firework. It was a flying death trap if you didn't know what you were doing. Hoover watched the base. It was mostly abandoned. The mechanics were frantically trying to get the few working planes ready to evacuate before the Russians arrived. Hoover noticed that one specific FW-190 seemed to be ready. A mechanic had just finished working on it. Hoover turned to Jerry. "I'm taking that plane." Jerry looked at him like he was insane. The FW-190 is a single-seat fighter. There was no passenger seat. Jerry said, "I'm not riding on the wing, Bob. I'll take my chances walking." They shook hands. Jerry disappeared back into the woods. Hoover was on his own. Hoover crept out of the tree line. He had managed to acquire a pistol during his trek, probably a rusty revolver or a discarded Luger. He walked right up to the Focke-Wulf. The German mechanic, who was standing on the wing, turned around. He froze. Here was a filthy, starving, wild-eyed American pointing a gun right at his chest. Hoover didn't speak German, and the mechanic didn't speak English. But a gun is a universal language. Hoover motioned with the pistol. "Start it." Chapter 5. The ignition. Hoover climbed into the cockpit. The smell of aviation fuel, leather, and German sweat filled his nose. He looked at the instrument panel. It was a chaotic mess of dials. He had to guess. He found what looked like the battery switch. He flipped it. The dials flickered. He found the fuel mixture lever. He found the throttle. But starting a 1940s fighter plane wasn't like turning the key in a Honda Civic. The FW-190 used an inertia starter. This meant someone on the outside had to spin up a heavy flywheel until it was screaming. And then the pilot engages a clutch that connects the spinning wheel to the massive engine, forcing the pistons to move. Hoover pointed the gun at the terrified mechanic and motioned to the engine. The mechanic understood. He didn't want to die for a lost war. He activated the starter. The inertia flywheel began to whine. It got louder and higher in pitch until it sounded like a siren. Hoover waited. He had to time it perfectly. If he engaged the clutch too early, it wouldn't start. Too late, and he'd flood the engine. He pulled the engagement handle. The massive BMW 801 radial engine caught. It belched a cloud of black smoke and oil, and then settled into a deafening, throbbing roar. The plane shook violently. Hoover waved the gun, dismissing the mechanic. The German jumped off the wing and ran for the woods. Hoover didn't wait for engine checks. He didn't check the oil pressure. He didn't care. He slammed the canopy shut. He jammed the throttle forward. The Butcher Bird leaped forward, tearing down the makeshift dirt runway. The acceleration pinned him back in his seat. He pulled back on the stick. The wheels left the dirt. He was flying. Stop and appreciate this for a second. He is a starving prisoner of war who just hijacked a top-tier enemy fighter plane in a language he doesn't understand, from a hidden base in the middle of Nazi Germany. He is free, but he has just made a terrible mistake. He is now the most hunted man in the sky. If this story is blowing your mind as much as it blew mine, please subscribe to G.I.Stories. We dig up the wildest files of the war so you don't have to. Now, let's talk about the flight of the swastika. Chapter 6. Friendly fire. Hoover was airborne. He retracted the landing gear. He pointed the nose west, towards Holland, towards the Allied lines. But the euphoria of freedom lasted exactly 30 seconds. Then, reality hit him. He was flying a Focke-Wulf 190. It had black iron crosses painted on the wings. It had a swastika painted on the tail. If the Germans saw him flying erratically, they might shoot him down for stealing it. But worse, much worse, were the Americans and the British. The Allied air forces had total air superiority in 1945. They had thousands of fighters patrolling the skies, specifically looking for Focke-Wulf 190s to destroy. If a P-51 Mustang spotted him, he would be blasted out of the sky in seconds. He didn't have a working radio to call them. He couldn't say, "Hey guys, it's Bob. Don't shoot." He had to disappear. Hoover shoved the stick forward. He dropped the plane down to the deck. We are talking 50 feet off the ground. He flew so low, he was buzzing the treetops. He flew through valleys and along riverbeds. He was using the terrain to hide from radar and from the eyes of Allied fighter pilots above. He flew like this for over an hour. He didn't know how much fuel he had. The gauge meant nothing to him. Eventually, the landscape began to change. The forests gave way to flat, flooded fields, canals, and windmills. He had reached the Netherlands. Holland. This area had recently been liberated by the Allies. It was safe territory, but the engine began to sputter. He was running on fumes. He had to put the plane down now. Chapter 7. The Pitchfork. Welcome. Hoover spotted a green field near a road. He didn't bother trying to lower the landing gear. He wasn't sure if the lever would work anyway, and a belly landing in a field is often safer. He cut the engine. The heavy fighter glided in it, hit the soft Dutch soil with a massive crash. Mud and grass flew everywhere as the metal belly scraped across the field, finally coming to a violent stop. Hoover was bruised, battered, but alive. He popped the canopy and climbed out onto the wing, taking a deep breath of free air. He had done it, but his celebration was interrupted. He looked up and saw a mob of angry Dutch farmers running toward the plane. And they were armed. They had pitchforks, they had shovels, they had old hunting rifles. They had spent 5 years under brutal Nazi occupation, and they had just seen a plane with a giant swastika crash into their field. They thought Hoover was a Nazi pilot, and they were ready to tear him apart. Hoover threw his hands in the air. He yelled, "American! I'm an American, Yankee!" The farmers stopped. They looked at this emaciated guy in filthy clothes. He didn't look like an arrogant Luftwaffe ace, but they didn't speak English. They kept their pitchforks leveled at his chest. For 5 terrifying minutes, Bob Hoover, the man who survived a dogfight, the Mediterranean Sea, 16 months in a POW camp, and stealing an enemy fighter, thought he was going to be stabbed to death by a Dutch farmer with a gardening tool. Suddenly, a military truck roared down the dirt road. It slammed on the brakes. Out jumped several Allied soldiers. They rushed into the field, shouting at the farmers to stand down. They looked at the crashed Focke-Wulf. Then they looked at Hoover. According to the legend, an Allied officer walked up to the starving pilot, looked at the Nazi plane, and asked, "Who are you? And where the hell did you get that?" Hoover just smiled. "I'm Bob Hoover, and I stole it." Conclusion: Bob Hoover didn't just survive the war, he became a legend. He became the backup pilot for the X-1 program, flying the chase plane when Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier. He became the greatest airshow pilot of the 20th century. He lived to be 94 years old, passing away in 2016. My grandfather never met Bob Hoover personally, but he kept this Luftwaffe patch, maybe traded with someone at the processing camp, or maybe just picked up as a souvenir of the wildest story going around the base that week. He kept it because it represented the ultimate triumph of the human will. War is a machine that tries to crush the individual. It tries to put you in a cage and take away your name. But some men refuse to be crushed. Bob Hoover looked at the cage. He looked at the enemy, and he decided to literally fly away with their most prized possession. What's the most daring escape story you've ever heard? Could you have figured out how to start that plane? Let me know in the comments below. This trunk has given me a new perspective on what it took to win that war. I'm Richard. Keep looking up, out.